It was a cold, moonless night when I found myself alone in the cemetery, long after the last mourners had left. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying flowers, a sickly, sweet perfume that clung to my nostrils. My footsteps echoed against the cracked tombstones as I made my way through the labyrinth of graves, the faint mist rising from the ground swirling around my ankles like ghostly fingers. The lanterns placed along the path flickered weakly, their flames barely holding against the oppressive darkness. I had stayed behind after the burial of an old friend, needing a moment to gather my thoughts. But now, as the silence deepened, a gnawing unease crept into my bones. Something was off. The cemetery, though still, felt anything but empty. As I walked further, my breath quickened, forming small clouds in the frigid air. The towering angel statues, meant to bring peace, cast eerie shadows that twisted and stretched unnaturally under the dim light. A crow perched on a gravestone let out a shrill cry before taking flight, the flapping of its wings unsettlingly loud in the stillness. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the exhaustion making me see movement where there was none. And yet the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing near an old, crumbling mausoleum. It was draped in black, its face obscured by the hood of a tattered cloak. I froze, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The figure did not move, did not breathe, yet its presence was palpable, suffocating. I forced myself to turn away, pretending I hadn't seen it. But as I walked faster, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me, slow and deliberate. I dared not look back. The narrow paths between the graves felt endless, the names on the tombstones blurring together as panic set in. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees like hushed voices conspiring in the dark. My hands trembled as I pulled my coat tighter around me, feeling the cold seep into my skin. Then, a sound sent my blood running cold, a whisper, low and rasping, coming from right behind me. You shouldn't have stayed. Spinning around, I found nothing but empty graves and withered flowers. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs shaking beneath me. But the whisper had been real. I knew it had. The shadows seemed to deepen, stretching unnaturally towards me, and a suffocating dread settled in my chest. I needed to leave. Now. But as I turned to flee, the path had changed. Where once there was a straight route to the gate, now stood rows of unfamiliar tombstones, a tangled maze that had no end. The cemetery was shifting, twisting into something unnatural. The lanterns flickered and died one by one, plunging me into near total darkness. A scraping sound, stone against stone, echoed from the mausoleum. My head snapped towards it just as the heavy door creaked open, revealing a yawning black void inside. I knew with every instinct screaming at me that something was coming. My legs refused to move, my body frozen in place as the shadows within the tomb seemed to writhe and swell. And then a hand, long, skeletal, with ragged flesh hanging from it, emerged from the darkness, grasping the edge of the doorway. My scream died in my throat. The thing that followed was no longer human. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine with a hunger so intense I could feel it gnawing at my soul. I stumbled backward, tripping over an uneven patch of dirt. My hands clawed at the ground, desperate to push myself up, but the air felt thick, heavy, as though unseen hands pressed down on my chest. The figure from before was gone, but I could feel its presence still, surrounding me, closing in. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of unintelligible words, until one phrase broke through with chilling clarity. You belong to us now. The realization hit me like ice. I would never leave this place. As the darkness enveloped me, I felt the cold fingers of the grave wrap around my limbs, pulling me down. The last thing I saw was the twisted grin of the thing emerging from the mausoleum, its jagged teeth gleaming in the abyssal void. Then, the earth swallowed me whole. The world around me spun into darkness, the cold earth closing in like a suffocating embrace. I tried to scream, but the invisible weight on my chest crushed any sound. The shadows whispered my fate, pulling me deeper and deeper into the endless abyss. My body refused to move, and for a moment I accepted that this was the end. Then, something inside me resisted. Maybe it was pure survival instinct, maybe a final flicker of hope. But I gathered every ounce of strength left in me and pushed against the suffocating darkness. My fingers clawed at the damp soil, pulling myself up inch by inch. The murmuring, voices turned into a deafening shriek, as if the very night itself protested my escape. The freezing cold burned my skin, but I kept fighting. Suddenly, the pressure.
We should have never entered that cemetery. It was supposed to be just a harmless adventure, a test of courage among friends. Lucas, Marina, and I had heard the old stories, the missing people, the shadows that moved on their own, the eerie whispers carried by the wind. But we laughed them off. It was just a cemetery after all. Stones and bones, nothing more. Or so we thought. The wrought iron gate groaned as we pushed it open, revealing the overgrown path ahead. The full moon bathed the tombstones in silver, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to twist and move as we walked past. Marina clung to my arm, whispering that we should turn back, but Lucas, ever the fearless one, pressed forward. "Come on," he urged. "Scared of a few old rocks?" His voice echoed unnaturally, swallowed too quickly by the surrounding darkness. I shivered, but I followed. Deeper into the graveyard, the silence became oppressive, thick like a suffocating blanket. The distant sound of crickets vanished, leaving only the crunch of dead leaves beneath our feet. We passed ancient mausoleums with cracked stone doors, their interiors yawning like hungry mouths. A gust of wind blew through the trees, carrying with it the distinct scent of decaying flowers. And then we heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like nails against wood. We froze. Marina squeezed my arm so tightly that her nails dug into my skin. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Lucas grinned, though it was strained. "Just the wind," he said. But even he didn't sound convinced. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, echoing from somewhere ahead. Our eyes darted to an old sunken grave where the dirt had been recently disturbed. My breath hitched. The tapping turned to scratching, then a slow, creaking noise, as if something beneath us was pushing its way to the surface. Marina let out, a choked sob, stepping back. "We have to go," she pleaded. But before we could turn, a shadow moved between the tombstones. Not a flicker, not a trick of the moonlight, an actual, shifting silhouette. It had no defined shape, no features, just an unnatural darkness that absorbed the feeble light around it. Lucas swore under his breath. We should have run then. We should have never looked back. But we did. The figure stepped forward, its presence freezing the air around us. The tapping had stopped. Instead, a low, guttural voice slithered through the night. "You should not be here." The words came from everywhere and nowhere, spoken without a mouth, filling our heads with something ancient and malevolent. My legs refused to move. Marina whimpered. Lucas, the fearless one, took a step forward, and the thing rushed him. A blur of darkness, a shriek that tore through the night, and then he was gone. Just gone. No sound. No struggle. As if the cemetery itself had swallowed him whole. Marina and I ran. We didn't stop until we reached the gate, slamming it shut, behind us. Only then did we realize that Lucas was truly gone. No screams, no calls for help, just silence. And as we stood there, gasping for breath, I swore I could hear it again. The tapping, closer this time, waiting. We stood there for a moment, our chests rising and falling in ragged breaths, our trembling hands gripping the cold iron gate. The silence of the cemetery wrapped around us, thick and oppressive. Lucas was gone, but he was still there. He had to be. "We can't leave him," Marina whimpered, clutching my jacket tightly. Fear was written all over her face, but I knew she was right. We couldn't just abandon him. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the primal instinct screaming at me to run and never look back. "We'll find him," I murmured, more to myself than to her. Pushing the gate open once more, we stepped back inside. Every step was torture. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward us. The air was colder than before, and the stench of decay grew stronger. The tapping, that damn tapping, had stopped. Now only silence remained. Then a faint sound. A groan. "Lucas," Marina whispered, eyes wide. Following the sound, we found ourselves in front of a crumbling mausoleum. Its stone door was slightly ajar, revealing nothing but an abyss of darkness inside. The stench of damp earth and rot was overwhelming. Trembling, I pulled out my phone, casting a weak glow into the darkness. That's when we saw him. Lucas lay on the stone floor, gasping for breath, his face pale as death. His eyes were wide, empty, as if he had seen something his mind refused to comprehend. But he was alive. Marina rushed to him, pulling at his arm. "Come on, we have to go." For a moment, Lucas didn't react, as if he were trapped in some kind of trance. But when we pulled him up, he finally blinked, snapping back to reality. We need to leave," he muttered, his voice weak, as if every word cost him great effort. That's when we felt it. Something was watching us. The shadows inside, the mausoleum twisted, pulsing as if they were alive. The temperature dropped further. A whisper filled the air, distant yet all around us, in a language we couldn't understand. Something moved in the darkness. Something that didn't want us to leave. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted. We ran through the graves, not daring to look back. The cemetery felt larger, distorted, as if it was shifting to keep us trapped. The tombstones seemed closer together, the familiar path now a tangled maze. Marina tripped, nearly falling, but Lucas caught her. Then, we saw the gate. We sprinted toward it, feet slipping on the damp ground. The moment we passed through, a loud slam echoed behind us, like something had tried to grab us but failed at the last second. Silence fell. The wind whispered through the trees. The world seemed normal again. We turned to Lucas. His face was still deathly pale, and something in his eyes had changed. He didn't say a word. He just stepped away from the gate, as if the mere thought of looking back was too much. "Let's get out of here," I muttered, grabbing Marina's hand and pulling Lucas along. None of us looked back. But as we walked away, a sound echoed on the wind. The tapping, soft, persistent, waiting.
I've worked as a gravedigger for over 20 years. In all that time, I've seen my fair share of strange things. Shadows that move when no one's around. The occasional whisper when the wind is still. But I always chalked it up to my imagination. That was until last winter, when something happened that I still can't explain. Something that made me question whether the dead ever truly rest. That night was colder than most. A thick fog had settled over the cemetery, creeping through the tombstones like living tendrils. I was finishing my last burial of the day, lowering the casket of an old man who had died alone, with no family to mourn him. As I shoveled the last mound of dirt over his grave, I heard it, a deep, guttural sigh like a breath from beneath the earth. I stopped, gripping the shovel so tight my knuckles turned white. My mind raced for a rational explanation, the ground settling maybe. But then I heard it again, a scraping sound, faint but unmistakable, coming from inside the coffin. My pulse pounded in my ears. I knew what I had to do. There were strict rules about disturbing the dead, but if there was even a chance that man was buried alive, I couldn't ignore it. With shaking hands, I retrieved the crowbar from my tool shed and returned to the fresh grave. I hesitated only a moment before driving the metal into the coffin's lid and prying it open. The wood creaked, the hinges groaning in protest. And then, silence. The coffin was empty. I staggered back, my breath turning to mist in the cold air. My mind struggled to make sense of it. I had placed the body inside with my own hands. There was no way, no possible way, it could have just disappeared. But before I could react, a shadow moved behind me. I turned, heart hammering, and saw the old man standing between the graves, his eyes hollow and dark, his mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You shouldn't have opened it," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the cemetery gates, throwing them shut behind me. I refused to return until morning, when the sun would chase away whatever horrors lurked in the night. But when I did, the grave was undisturbed, the dirt still perfectly packed, the coffin lid sealed as if it had never been touched. Only the crowbar lying beside the grave bore witness to what I had seen. Now every time I work a late shift, I hear the whispers. I see the shadows, and sometimes, just sometimes, I catch a glimpse of the old man watching me from the fog.
If you enjoyed these real horror stories and want more chilling tales, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you the scariest stories from around the world. And if you've ever had a terrifying experience, share it in the comments. We'd love to hear it if you dare.